tener dos exposiciones en la parte de la mañana. Una hizo tocar Francisco de Asís, que nos dejó, o sea, su vida.
Agora vamos escutar o Cardeal Seán Patrick O'Malley. É uma alegria para nós muito grande tê-lo aqui, porque no Senhor, bem como nos demais que nos falaram, vemos conjugando vemos uma pessoa muito grande, mas que não deixou de ser um irmão menor. Isso nos alegra muito. Quando o Senhor falou no Encontro do Panamericano dos Jovens, com seu testemunho, com sua palestra, gerou nas Américas, porém muitas outras partes, onde foi difundido o vídeo de sua palestra, algo muito bonito, dos irmãos que acolheram seu testemunho de vida e que faz crescer em nós o desejo de sermos também bons capuchinhos. Muito obrigado por estar aqui, eminência. O Cardeal O'Malley, professor como frade capuchinho em 1965. Foi ordenado sacerdote em setembro. Obteve o doutorado em literatura espanhola e portuguesa na Universidade Católica da América, onde também foi professor de 69 até 73. O Cardeal O'Malley fundou o Centro Católico Hispano, uma organização que ajuda os imigrantes em Washington. Foi nomeado bispo da Diocese de St. Thomas, nas Virgin Islands, em 1985. Depois da Diocese de Fall River, em Massachusetts, em 1992. Palm Beach, na Flórida, em 2002. E, finalmente, nomeado arcebispo de Boston em 2003. Foi criado o Cardeal pelo Papa Bento XVI em março de 2006. O Cardeal O'Malley é membro do comitê da Conferência dos Bispos Católicos dos Estados Unidos para atividades pró-vida, para a direção da Universidade Católica da América, entre outros. Em 2010, o Papa Bento designou o Papa Bento XVI designou o Cardeal O'Malley como visitador da Igreja na Irlanda. Em 2013, o Papa Francisco nomeou o Cardeal O'Malley membro do Conselho de Cardeais. Em 2014, membro da Comissão Pontifícia para a Proteção dos Menores. E desde então muitos outros encargos importantes na igreja. Mas para nós o mais importante é que é o nosso irmão. Ele é capuchinho como nós. E assim nós queremos escutar sua iluminação aos capuchinhos de todas as Américas. Muito obrigado por estar aqui conosco.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigado, Frei Maria Osvaldo.
Esta manhã escutaram os catedráticos. Agora vai escutar o encanador. Gostaria de começar com uma oração da ressurreição. Maria de Nazaré, Maria de castigo, fez mais forte a minha fé, e contigo me adotou. Às vezes eu paro e fico a pensar, e sem perceber me vejo a rezar, e o meu coração se põe a cantar pra Virgem de Nazaré. Menina que Deus Deus amor escolheu, pra mãe de Jesus, o Filho de Deus, Maria que o povo inteiro elegeu, Senhora e Mãe do céu. Ave Maria, Ave Maria, Ave Maria, Mãe de Jesus.
First of all, I would like to say a word of gratitude to General, to the mission that has worked so hard to organize this extraordinary exercise in fraternity, which will certainly bear much fruit and help us to grow in our vocation and conversion. I am very grateful and humbled to be included and touched by the hospitality and fraternity of Frei Cardeal and our Brazilian brothers. Today, the topic assigned to me is our charismatic presence in the Church of the Americas. The presence of the Capuchin charism is incarnational. It's manifested in our lives, in our conversion, in our ministry. When the charism is strong in our hearts, its presence is strong in the church. The intensity of our conversions is what makes the charism present, real and visible. To me, it's helpful to reflect on St. Francis's conversion to understand what our charism is and how it manifests itself. We often speak of the two episodes of Francis' conversion that are most salient. The first moment is when the crucified Lord bids Francis from the cross of San Damiano to rebuild the church. It was a moment when the church sorely needed to be reformed. The gospel needed to be placed at the center of the life of the church, and evangelization needed to be the priority. The other episode, of course, so often commented on, is described by Francis in his last testimony, his encounter with the leper. The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. The Lord himself led me among them, and I showed a heart full of mercy to them. When I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. Afterwards, I tarried a little and left the world. But the third episode, which is often overlooked when we speak about Francis's conversion, is what takes place in Bishop Guido's patio in 1206. The famous Folio di San Francesco, where St. Francis is tried before the bishop, and where our holy founder stripped off his clothes and put them at the feet of his father, saying, Finora ho chiamato te, mio padre sulla terra, d'ora in poi posso dire con tanta sicurezza, Padre nostro che sei nel cielo. I'm so pleased that the Bishop of Assisi has given us Maria Maggiore. Before, the only notable building we had in Assisi was the Grebellina. But now we have that wonderful church where this crucial moment in the conversion of Francis takes place. And of course, it's wonderful that the body of Blessed Carlo Acutis is also there. To me, this moment is crucial in the life of Francis. It is his kenosis. It's a gesture that betokens what Charles de Foucault describes in his prayer of abandonment. To me, this is the theological basis of Francis's vocation, his absolute trust in the fatherhood of God, his love for creation, his call to be a universal brother, his evangelical poverty and dependence upon providence, his desire to follow Jesus poor and crucified, whose incarnation is a manifestation of the Father's love for the world. Having renounced his clothes, his culture, his class, the wealth and education that separated him from the masses, and placing his whole life in God's hands, makes Francis totally available to follow Christ and announce the good news. He has literally put off the old man and put on the new. He has discovered his purpose and vocation in a radical call to be a son of our Heavenly Father and a universal brother. Because this charism is so strong in him, it spreads like wildfire. His vocation changed the course of history. His conversion changed the course of history. Rebuild Christ's church. And the same conversion, the same vocation, has summoned us here from all over the Americas, so that we can stir into flames the spiritual gifts that have been given to us as Capuchin Franciscan friars. The charism we have received is not a document, a philosophy, or a theory. It's a way of life that is transmitted by men whose hearts are on fire with the love of the gospel. Hence, our charism becomes presence when it is incarnate in our hearts, and we seek to bring this gift to the church and society. The path that Pope Francis holds out for us is that of closeness, vicinanza. As Capuchins, we must be close to God. The prayer life that is real, that is shared, that is a fruit of contemplation and reflection of the Word of God. Our closeness with the poor and crucified Christ is the hallmark of our spirituality. Without this deep faith, Franciscanism can degenerate into a superficial folklore. When I first arrived in my second diocese, Fall River, I was visiting a nursing home. And as I walked down the corridor, I heard an old lady whisper to her friend, pointing to me. She said, "I have a statue of him in my garden." I said to myself, I hope it's not a bird bath. Our Jesuit Pope has helped to rescue the radical nature of Franciscan spirituality from this itch in his two Franciscan encyclicals. Ordinarily, encyclicals begin with a Latin title derived from the first words of the encyclical, Humanae Vitae, Rerum Novarum, Mater Magistra. However, two of Francis's encyclicals sport Italian names, Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. Not only do these encyclicals derive their names from the ipsissima verba de St. Francis, but they document the radical spirituality of Francis that is born out of his vocation and radical abandonment into the hands of a loving Father. Two traditional ways that our Capuchin charism was manifest in the life of the friars were in our porters and questors. The province of St. Augustine, to which I gratefully belong, was established by Bavarian friars. We cultivated a great devotion to Brother Conrad. Indeed, when we read about the saints of the order, beginning with Felix and Cantalice, Brother de Gracias, we discover how these friars, charged with begging door to door for the needs of the monastery and of the poor, achieved such extraordinary personal sanctity, and at the same time made a huge impact on the church and society. These friars not only collected food, they also established closeness, vicinanza, with people. They received the food, but they also visited the sick, gave marriage counseling, taught children how to pray, listened to people's sorrows and laments, brought joy and companionship to the lonely. Talk about vicinanza. Some historians say the Capuchins were the bulwark that kept the Protestant Reformation from sweeping over southern Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy. Many cite great preachers like St. Fidelis for this reason. But I like to think that the friendship and the closeness of the brother questors is what kept people in the church. I don't think we ever embraced this practice in the United States. The excuse being that the Protestants would be scandalized at the specter of lazy friars exploiting the generosity of the naive masses. Ironically enough, in some of our provinces with strong immigrant communities, it would have been feasible to continue the tradition. I have many friends from different parts of Europe who share with me their experience of the friars coming to their farms and homes, learning the names of all the children, and bringing joy and delight to the families that felt privileged to receive the friars and were happy to be able to share their blessings with the friars and with the poor they served. Francis obviously wanted us to be worker bees, not drones. But he saw the great value of begging. It teaches us humility. It teaches us interdependence. It teaches us that the widow's mite can be a treasure. Jesus and the apostles lived on the largesse of those first disciples who gladly shared the belongings with Jesus to be part of his mission. Questoring was never just about collecting donations. It was more about establishing relationships, having recourse to the table of the Lord, depending on divine providence, and about being a lesser brother. Being a bishop, I've come to observe that very often members of religious orders who are pastors are more paternalistic than their diocesan counterparts. I must confess that reflecting on my own years as a pastor, I was like my religious confreres, too paternalistic to challenge my parishioners to be more generous in their support of the church and the works of evangelization. The attitude of the religious priest was often, these poor people don't have enough for themselves and their families. How can we ask them to contribute to the church? I have found diocesan priests much better in challenging people to make sacrifices, to give them a sense of ownership and responsibility for the material needs of the community. And if diocesan priests are better at this, the Protestants are the best. They say Protestants give tithes and Catholics give a tip. Being a quaestor was a good antidote to our paternalism, because it communicates to people that we need them. We need to take care of each other, even when our resources are limited. This is what we see in the Acts of the Apostles, in a community of faith, where people were quick to share the belongings with one another. In addition to those friars who were quaestors, we're blessed by many porters who were the face of our charis, and to countless people who knock on the door of our monasteries. In parish life, it's the parish secretary as a very important member of the pastoral team and needs to be carefully chosen for that responsibility. Pope Francis once said that in his diocese of Buenos Aires, one parish had a secretary who was known as the tarantula. I know that in some places we have lay people serving, answering our doors and our phones, but the tradition of having a friar to offer welcoming hospitality to those who seek us out is a great blessing. As I mentioned earlier, in our province we have such devotion to Brother Conrad of Malta. And more recently in the United States, we celebrated the beatification of Blessed Solanus Casey. To my special devotion, because I too am an Irish infiltrator in a German province. Father Solanus was unable to pass the procura exams in German and ended up being the monastery porter for most of his life. Although he was a priest, he did not hear confessions or preach. He received the people who came to the monastery and provided a listening ear, food, and friendship to the thousands of people during the Great Depression who turned to the friars for help and solace. When I was a young friar, coming as a translator for the general chapters and the international meetings, I met Brother Bruno, who was the porter at our general curiate in Rome. Brother Bruno was from the German province. He's half German and half Vietnamese. He looks like a big Buddha and is the most non-threatening person I ever met. He had a great gift for languages, something that is so useful for the curiate. But more than that, he had a great gift for friendship. He was a good listener and a kind man. Among the many people that flocked to see him at Setenta Piemonte were many singers and actors and opera stars, all from the world of entertainment. Our Father General at the time was very concerned to see those beautiful actresses climbing out of stretched limousines to visit Brother Bruno. He thought it was bruta figura. Consequently, the decision was made to send Brother Bruno back to Germany in exile. As Bishop of the Virgin Islands, I went to visit him in Frankfurt. While I was there, he had me performing baptisms and hearing confessions in many different languages, because there were so many immigrants in Frankfurt at the time, and they didn't have priests stationed there who spoke Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and English. Later on, when I went to the anniversary of the friars in Munster, part of the celebration brought together all the local talents of singers and musicians who were all clients of Brother Bruno. Brother Conrad, Brother Solanus Casey, Brother Bruno, and countless Capuchin porters have been the incarnation of the Capuchin charism, with thousands of visitors knocking on the doors of our houses. These men offered hospitality, friendship, prayer, and the consolation of being listened to. Being a Capuchin is about being a universal brother, welcoming strangers and those who are seeking. When I ordained deacons, and we do the reading of the encounter of Philip with the Ethiopian eunuch, I like to remind them of the importance of that ministry of one-on-one. The eunuch is seeking for God, trying to understand the scriptures. Philip is there to patiently help him discover the presence of Christ and the call to discipleship. Philip's ministry seemed quite limited, just one man, but that man took the faith back to a country. The presence of our charism in the humblest one-on-one ministries, like being a quaestor or porter, have often been undervalued. Our question must be how to replicate these historic experiences in our world. Not that we can all be porters or quaestors, but we have to imitate that intensity of conversion and their vicinanza. In the Seventh Plenary Council of the Order, our Fraternal Life and Ministry minority, held in Assisi in 2004, the friars gathered there with Brother John Corriveau, then Minister General of the Order, and produced a very compelling document on the theme of minority. To quote from one of the resolutions, society in the time of Francis was marked by the struggle for social dominance, which unleashed strong violence. Francis too was influenced by this, but after his conversion, he turned to the fringes of Assisi society, choosing to live among the lowly and the marginalized. This led Francis to the deep intuition that human relationships had to mirror the Trinitarian love of three persons without privilege or priority, and then make a courageous choice of minority, which redeemed and radically reconstituted his relationships. Authority without power which dominates. Service characterized by humility. Extension of fraternal relationships to all creation. A life lived on the social periphery. Franciscan minority today demands courageous choices for a more fraternal world. The same document links minority with contemplation. Since minority is not a natural way that is easily chosen, both fraternities and brothers need ongoing formation in order to acquire a spirit of service in minority. It's essential to develop an ability to view things contemplatively, especially through the community exercise of silent prayer. The journey of the first Capuchins to the periphery was also a journey to contemplation and silence, open to the world. The lesser brother is one who contemplates above all a God who humbles himself in the manger, on the cross, and in the Eucharist, and who never loses sight of his brothers and sisters, especially the poorest. The hermitage for the first Capuchins was always on the edges of town. It's not a place in which to avert one's gaze, but to acquire a broader vision of reality, contemplated from the vantage point of God and the poor. As so many of our documents say, we should give priority to ministries that are in keeping with our vocation as minors, assuming pastoral commitments on the boundaries and the periphery, especially ministries that are least sought after in the church, where we can more easily manifest compassion and closeness to people, whether in out-of-the-way parishes, hospital chaplaincies, the ministry of the sick, marginalized, who suffer poverty in forms old and new. The years I spent living among the poor at the Centro Católico were certainly a time is very transformative in my life. At times, it was scary. And at times, what was bitter was changed into sweetness, in the words of St. Francis. But we cannot romanticize what living among the poor is about. For me, it was an adventure. Being in this tenement building, seldom had lot of heat or hot water, many rats and cockroaches, and had only a picnic table for furniture. But the scary part was the violence in which the poor people are submerged day and night. There were many gunfights in the building where I lived. So one day I decided I was going to have a meeting of all the people that lived in this tenement building, gathered them in the entrance and put a table in the middle of the room and gave them an impassioned speech against guns. I asked everyone to turn in their gun and we were going to visit the police. My appeal was met with silence by everybody in the room. Finally, this old grandmother opened up her pocketbook, took out a huge pistol, waved it under my nose, and said, "Father, no one's going to do anything to you. Me, I'm keeping my gun." Once addressing Franciscan friars in their chapter, our former general, Brother Mauro, talked about his own experience living among the homeless. He said, when he lived among them as a theology student, he discovered that the poor are far from being simple and submissive. They were often drunk and extremely argumentative, not to add that they stank and were disheveled. Reflecting on it, he realized that it is very important to encounter the lepers like Francis did. The encounter that changed his life. The lepers continued to emanate the unpleasant odors, and their presence was far from pleasurable. We have to avoid every form of romanticism. But to me, I try and read a little bit of the constitutions each day, and I'm struck by how often they're calling on us to live among the poor, to share the lot of the poor. And I know how scary this is for a lot of people. But I think it's something that we need to consider. In the encounter of Francis with the leper was not changed, but Francis was. It made him capable of a new and surprising gesture to the point of experiencing real sweetness. Even in his words of Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium ring in our ears when the Holy Father says, life grows by being given away, and it weakens in isolation and comfort. Indeed, those who enjoy life most are those who leave security on the shore and become excited by the mission of communicating life to others. In today's world of highly competitive, individualistic, autonomous self, addicted to celebrity and entertainment, the charism of Francis of Assisi is more urgently needed than ever. The enthusiastic response of the whole world to the themes of Pope Francis's pontificate illustrates how hungry our world is for the spirit of the gospel, poverty and simplicity, community and minority, mercy and tenderness. More than ever, the world is divided by haves and have-nots, the rich and beautiful people and the great unwashed. Our Capuchin vocation to minority is part of the antidote necessary for society's sickness. I'm very grateful that in our province, we're delighted to see the wonderful spirit of fraternity. I've often been a beneficiary of that paternal love and support, which means so much to me in my own Capuchin vocation. But our spirit of brotherhood cannot be limited just to our Capuchin family. Our minority needs to color our relationships with each other and our relationships with the outside community. For Francis, minority was not just about being nice. It's about loving people in a way that puts them first. Minority means being happy to take the last place. In our relationships with each other, we must avoid all envy and competition. We need to learn to celebrate the talents and gifts of our brothers, rather than look for opportunities to put down people or to criticize. We must cultivate attitudes of empathy and compassion. We must rejoice at our brothers' triumphs and grieve over their blunders as if they were our own. Minority is the principal way by which we evangelize in today's world. When I was in the seminary, they used to tell us the Capuchins were the church's marines, always prepared to take the most difficult assignments, to go to the periphery, to tackle the most difficult problems. The way we do this is not necessarily from the position of power and wealth, but rather walking with those who are on the margins, those who are forgotten, those who are invisible. As I mentioned before, I was saddened at the synod on the Amazonia when Capuchin bishops talked about how difficult it was to get friars to join them there. I'm delighted to hear about what the Brazilian friars are doing now with the new communities. Pope Francis is challenging us to go to the periphery, to have the smell of the sheep. As one wag once said, St. Francis kissed the leper, we give him penicillin. Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium states very clearly that our preferential option for the poor also needs to be a preferential pastoral option, making sure that the poor and those on the margins receive the pastoral care they need. Too often we act as if people did live by bread alone. St. Francis's life was very much conditioned by the social atmosphere in which he was raised. There were deep divisions in society between rich and poor. Francis' vocation led him to cross the barrier from his upper middle class background to become one of those lesser people, minorities. I think there are certain parallels with the social evolution taking place in our own countries that has recently been aggravated by the pandemic. You will find so many working class Americans, for instance, who are without job security, without the possibility of owning their own home. They're not getting married, not having children, and they're having children out of wedlock, not going to church, not successfully getting their children through high school and into college, and not knowing anyone who wasn't in the same boat. One of the most stunning findings is the complete segregation of Americans according to class. It is Assisi in 2026. People in different zip codes, postal codes, could be on different planets. In the United States, as throughout the Americas, our original sin is racism. The extermination of indigenous peoples, the destruction of their culture, the enslavement of Africans abducted and forced to live their lives in chattel. African American men comprise a mere 6% of the population in the United States, but they are nearly half of the 2 million inmates in prison in the United States. Several studies have concluded that overall more Black males are in prison than are enrolled in college or university. And according to one study, there are more African American men incarcerated in the United States than the total prison populations of India, Argentina, Canada, Lebanon, Japan, Germany, Finland, Israel, and England combined. In my own province, we've been very blessed by many vocations that truly represent the Catholicity of our church and our Franciscan vocation to be universal brothers. It didn't happen by accident. Tom Bex and Moses and others worked very hard to promote vocations that represent the church's diversity, and we have been blessed. I was visitator for 20 seminaries in Latin America. In one of the oldest seminaries in Central America, in a country where the majority of the population are indigenous. When I arrived there for the visitation, the rector proudly told me, we have our first indigenous seminary in 500 years. In another country that is mostly Black population, out of 60 seminarians, there was one Black seminarian. Our present diversity challenges all of us to a deeper conversion that allows us to overcome ethnic prejudices and to appreciate the treasures in cultures other than our own. At the same time, we are positioned well to be bridges between different communities and to be present with so many of our brothers and sisters at the periphery in a way that is not condescending, but truly fraternal. In my own country, it's very quickly becoming Hispanic. When I first went to Washington, studying there, as a deacon, I was told I was going to go and work in Easter Island. But before my priesthood ordination, the Archbishop went to the provincial and said, I only have one priest that speaks Spanish. Leave that brother here. And so I ended up staying in Washington. Today, I would say the majority of the Catholics in the Archdiocese of Washington are Hispanics. Nationwide, 55% of all Catholics under 30 years of age are Hispanic. But more stunningly, 70% of all Catholics under 19 years of age in the United States are Hispanic. And despite that, only 3% of our students in Catholic schools are Hispanic, which means we have more non-Catholics in Catholic schools nationwide than Hispanics. And only 10% of Hispanic children are involved in our catechetical programs. Hispanic population is also the most economically deprived. The children of the immigrants often end up leaving the church. It is a great challenge to all of us. I was so happy when Father was talking about our ministries at the border this morning. It's a demographic that requires more pastoral attention from the entire church, and hopefully will receive more attention from our own provinces as we're blessed to have more and more vocations from this kind of community. Being faithful to our promises of poverty, chastity, and obedience will make us good religious, but living the charism of minority and fraternity is what makes us good Capuchinhos. We want to live the gospel of life acutely aware of the fact that the protagonists of Jesus' gospel are the lepers, the widows, the blind, the lame, the halt, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, and the sinners. The Lazarus on our doorstep cannot be an invisible beggar, but rather he must become for us a neighbor, a friend, a brother. At the Last Supper, the apostles were fighting for the best places at table. Jesus washed their feet to teach us to stop fighting over the best places at table and start fighting over the towel. That's a fight we Capuchins need to win, discreetly, of course. An important outcome of Francis's spirituality of abandonment to the fatherhood of God is his vocation embodied the beatitude, "Blessed are the peacemakers, they shall be called the children of God." Francis was a peacemaker. The beautiful peace prayer of St. Francis captures his spirit of seeking to love rather than to be loved. Although he did not write these words, he lived them profoundly enough as to have a legitimate claim on the peace prayer, which is an apt description of his spirituality. I remember reading in one of the biographies of Francis how when he heard a poor, mentally ill man shouting, "Pax et bonum," Francis decided to make that the official reading of the order. It shows that we can learn something from everyone, even from the poor man who everyone thinks is mentally impaired, uneducated, or even crazy. Francis could see wisdom and beauty where other people saw only trash. In the Rule of 1223, St. Francis writes, "The friars shall not be quarrelsome, or take part in disputes with words, or criticize others, but they shall be gentle, peaceful, unassuming, courteous, and humble, speaking respectfully to everyone. Whatever house they enter, they shall first say, 'Peace be to this house.'" Francis was truly a peacemaker. He helped establish peace between Perugia and Assisi. He brought peace between the mayor and the bishop of Assisi. And at the time when Christian nations were organizing armies to fight against the Muslims, Brother Francis made a fraternal visit to the Sultan. If Francis's approach had prevailed over the militaristic desire to conquer the Muslims, the history of today's world would be much different, and the enmity between Islam and the West could have been averted. Francis's pacifism did much to dampen the incessant wars that broke out constantly throughout Europe. When St. Francis established the Third Order, he gave his secular followers a rule that prescribed simplicity in dress, considerable fasting and abstinence, and the canonical offices and other prayers. But because of the prohibition of bearing arms, the followers of this rule came into conflict with local authorities, who customarily required men to carry arms for service in their militias. The prohibition against carrying arms dealt a blow to the feudal system and the ever-fighting factions of Italian municipalities. In the Third Order, the poor and rich, nobles and common people, the social classes were brought nearer to each other. There are so many divisions in our world today, divisions that are growing deeper and ugly. The world needs peacemakers, bridge builders. As followers of Francis, we too are called to be peacemakers. This is part of our vocation to be universal brothers. The Holy Father is calling us to be more synodal, a synodal church where we learn to listen to each other, to pray together, and to discern God's will in our lives. It's an affirmation that the Holy Spirit is guiding the church. Our task as peacemakers is to bring about greater unity. It's not surprising that the secular Franciscan, Chiara Lubich, has given us the world the beautiful expression of the Franciscan charism of unity, unum sint. She learned her spirituality from the Capuchinhos in Trento, Italy. As a young friar studying in our seminary in Washington, We were often in communication with our missionaries in Papua New Guinea by means of the ham radio. It was a new mission that had been given to our province when our provincial, Father Victor Green, wrote to Rome asking that we be assigned to a new mission, and he wanted it to be the most difficult mission in the world. The response was immediate. The friars were to go to Papua New Guinea. The tribes that were living there in such isolation, speaking hundreds of languages, still practiced cannibalism. They had never heard the gospel or knew any Christians. We tell the story that when the plane landed in the highlands and friars got out, through interpreter, the natives wanted to know whether the plane was a male or a female. They said, if it's a female, we want an egg. Those people received the gospel with such joy and gratitude. It was a liberation for them. Recently, they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the arrival of the gospel there. And the people were so emotional when they talked about the liberation and the joy that was brought to them with the gospel. They lived in such darkness, such fear, such violence, constant warfare, superstition. But one of the most amazing things that happened when I was in the seminary, it was reported to us by the friars, was that a group of these new Christians traveling far from the Capuchin mission happened upon natives from another part of the island who were also Christians, but they were Lutherans. The fact that there could be divisions among Christ's followers was a great source of sorrow to these new Catholics. They returned to the mission and complained to the friars. They were so scandalized. Something that we all take for granted for these new Christians was a scandal and heartbreaking. If it's a scandal that there are so many divisions among different denominations, how much greater the scandal when the divisions are within the Catholic Church itself or within our religious families. Being artisans of peace and builders of unity are important ways that we Capuchins can contribute to rebuilding the church. It's important to be able to articulate the church's teachings, even those that are most difficult, but that we do it with love. Austin Ivory wrote a very beautiful book a couple of years ago called How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice. The challenge Pope Francis places before us is to be evangelizers, to evangelize with beauty and joy. The Holy Father says in Evangelii Gaudium, to communicate the moral teachings that promote growth in the gospel way of life, it's helpful to stress again and again the attractiveness and ideal of a life of wisdom, self-fulfillment, and enrichment. In light of that positive message, our rejection of the evils which endanger that life can be better understood. Rather than experts in dire predictions, dour judgments, bent on rooting out every evil and deviation, we should appear as joyful messengers of challenging proposals, guardians of goodness and beauty, who shine forth in a light of fidelity to the gospel. Unity is Christ's ardent desire expressed at the Last Supper. We must be promoters of unity as part of our mission to be universal brothers and peacemakers. We read in our constitutions, number 107, I'm afraid I don't have the English one with me, but I only have the Portuguese language. I let the translators translate it. Segundo el Espíritu de São Francisco, anunciemos a paz e a salvação, não apenas com palavras, mas também as difundamos com iniciativas inspiradas pela caridade fraternal. Movidos por esse espírito, como estilo evangélico, esforcemos-nos para levar uma convivência pacífica e estável, os que estão divididos pelo ódio, pela inveja, pelos conflitos ideológicos, pelas diferenças de classe, da raça, de religião e de nacionalidade. Promovamos o respeito, a dignidade e os direitos das pessoas, sobretudo dos pobres e dos marginalizados. Colaboremos ainda vivamente com as iniciativas e organizações nacionais e internacionais que trabalham honestamente pela unidade do gênero humano, pela justiça universal e pela paz. Assim seremos testemunhas da esperança do Senhor Deus e ajudaremos as pessoas da boa vontade a reconhecer Deus Pai onipotente e soberano. Because, like Francis, we will have cried out from the deepest place in our hearts, our Father, who art in heaven. Amen.
Agradecemos al señor Shonomale por esta iluminación que nos da en esta tarde. Y ahora tenemos un espacio para un diálogo con él, para algunas preguntas, para algún comentario, para algún aporte que alguien quiera hacerlo. Entonces, señor, podemos quizás quedarnos aquí. Si alguien tiene algo que quería preguntar, que quería aportar, decir algo. Empezamos haciendo una pregunta, la misma que hicimos a los dos otros conferencistas. Esta es la primera vez, Monseñor, que estamos consiguiendo hacer un Panamericano, que estamos dividiendo esta barrera entre la América Latina, y Estados Unidos y Canadá. Existe la barrera lingüística, pero también podemos superar esto. Usted, como norteamericano, ¿cómo ve este encuentro? ¿Cómo ve lo que puede surgir? Y es importante que las Américas caminemos en conjunto, que esto puede iluminar hacia el futuro.
Pues el mundo es cada vez más chico y nosotros también tenemos que estar más en comunicación los unos con nosotros. Y también la migración en este hemisferio es increíble, como he mencionado muchas veces, solo en Boston tenemos 200,000 brasileños. Tenemos millones y millones de inmigrantes no documentados de Latinoamérica y del Caribe que están en los Estados Unidos. Y así la colaboración de las iglesias del hemisferio es muy importante. Pero aún más entre nosotros. Si vamos a ser hermanos universales, tenemos que comenzar siendo realmente hermanos los unos a los otros. En el pasado, muchas veces, tal vez por las distancias y
Intervenções aí que vem das vezes.
no
Entendi,
tener
então,
como
pelo
la
que parece.
federación de
Aí eu
provincias,
te passo.
pero hoy en día queremos vernos como una familia y estar más en contacto. Así esta iniciativa es genial, una oportunidad de conocernos, de estar juntos, de aprender más de las otras provincias, de compartir nuestros ideales y nuestras esperanzas y anhelos para el futuro. Gracias.
Pela manhã nós falamos a respeito do itinerário feito em direção do mundo novo. Penso que esse é o momento também de buscarmos uma igreja nova, o mesmo rosto, porém, sem grandes novidades, mas apenas com resgates especiais daquilo que é essencial para a nossa história de fé e para a nossa caminhada como cristãos. Pergunto ao senhor, que é um dos homens próximo ao Papa Francisco, que tem nos ensinado tanto com o seu jeito de ser, com o seu testemunho, mais do que com o discurso, quais ainda as barreiras mais difíceis para fazer com que, de fato, vivamos aquilo que ele nos propõe no mundo de hoje. Pela via da simplicidade, voltar ao Evangelho.
En el Papa Francisco tenemos un ejemplo, una persona que siempre está yendo a la periferia, siempre está buscando a los que están más alejados, ¿no? Que es la prioridad del buen pastor, que va en busca de la oveja descarriada para traerla a casa, ¿no? Nosotros estamos viviendo en un momento de tanta polarización en la iglesia. Y nuestra misión es de ser hombres de paz, de reconciliación, de unidad. Y yo creo que es una aportación enorme que podemos hacer, pero tenemos que empezar construyendo este espíritu de hermandad entre nosotros para que podamos compartir ese ideal con los demás. Gracias. ¿Alguien más? ¿Ya? ¿No?
This question doesn't deal with one of the major themes of your talk to us, but you mentioned indigenous people. Indigenous people ministry to a relationship with indigenous people is a big factor in North and South America. I've been very saddened lately by all the publicity about the residential schools in Canada and some of the students complaining of abuse there many years ago, also in the United States. You mentioned some issues with incorporation of indigenous people into the Church of Latin America. What should we Capuchins be thinking about doing with respect to this group of people who were the natives to our land before our ancestors came here, those of us whose ancestors are from Europe and other places? You also mentioned Papua New Guinea, literally indigenous people, and yet the experience of those people with the church is so positive. I've been there many times, as you know, and yet in North and South and Central America, there's a divide, there's a problem. Could you say something about that?
Well, as you know, the Holy Father met with a group of indigenous people just recently, and he's going to go to Canada for the Feast of St. Anne. For some reason, in Canada, the indigenous people and the gypsies have great devotion to St. Anne, and they all go to the shrine of St. Anne de Beaupré for the Feast of St. Anne. So the Holy Father is going to be there to personally meet with them. But I think the difference between the native population in Papua New Guinea. And the indigenous population in the United States and the Americans and the Black population is that they were never the victims of racism the way that our people in the Americas have been. When I was bishop in the Caribbean, 2 blocks from my cathedral was the old slave market. And on one of the islands of my diocese, there was a slave rebellion at one time. And when the slaves heard that the king of Denmark, who owned the islands, had said to the Navy, when they saw the ships, all the slaves on the island committed suicide because they were more afraid of the cruel treatment that they would get because of their rebellion. And the statistics that I gave about prisons in the United States, I think this is very telling, but it's not just in the United States. We have this, as I would say, the original sin of the Americas is racist. But the greatest antithesis of that is our Franciscan vocation of being universal brothers, to help tear down those barriers and help people feel part of one family. This morning, Father also talked about Fratelli Tutti, and what a wonderful document that is, and it's so challenging, but it's truly a contribution of Francis to our modern world. But I think we have an awful lot to do. I don't want to talk about specific countries because this is something that, as I say, is a problem of this hemisphere. But the more that we are aware of it, the more that we're trying to overcome this legacy and bring healing and justice is very, very important.
Muy bien, ¿alguna otra hermana?
Uma pergunta que chegou pelas redes sociais. Chegou do Frei Adriano Lima, é atualmente o nosso representante da CCB no Conselho Internacional de Formação. Ele pergunta: a partir dos conhecimentos do senhor de toda a dinâmica formativa da ordem, o que o senhor pensa ser essencial a ser trabalhado como diretriz formativa para as novas gerações dos frades mais jovens que estão chegando a partir deste encontro panamericano?
Creo que esta es una oportunidad, como le dije, de sentirnos más como familia y tratar de superar el aislamiento que ha sido parte de nuestra historia por demasiado tiempo. Espero que habrá iniciativas que podemos compartir entre nuestras provincias. Yo sé que ha habido algunas iniciativas ya, pero esto nos ayudaría mucho, ¿no? La formación que se está dando, compartiendo noviciados, etc., ha sido muy, muy positivo y yo creo que esta conferencia puede dar más impulsos a estas iniciativas.
Gave us some beautiful images and cameos. The woman with the pistol, Brother Bruno, the visit to the nursing home and the statue. Those moments so beautifully illustrate the building blocks of a Capuchin vocation. Tell us one more of your favorite Capuchin stories. Or two.
my province, it's almost legendary, but at one point, we were voting in the House chapter whether to allow television. And it was one of our friars who had collected all of the stamps that the merchants used to give. And got thousands and thousands of these stamps. You could redeem them at a store. And he had a whole room full of these stamps, and he wanted to buy a television set for the monastery. And in the House chapter, we had quite a heated debate. And I was leading the anti-television set party, and he was in favor of the television set. Well, they won by one vote. And the next day, they brought in this huge color television set. The following day, it was stolen. So the day he died, he blamed me. But, the other story that I often tell people, I think that maybe I mentioned this before, when at a house chapter, we were supposed to decide what penances we were going to do for Lent. And the superior wrote them all on the blackboard, and then we had a vote. And so he was about to announce the things that received the most votes. And there was one lay brother that never said anything. But this day he said, "Father, don't you think we should choose the penance that got the least votes?"
Gracias por sus palabras, hermano Seán. Me gustaría si podría, usted mencionó que para ser un buen religioso debemos ser fieles a nuestros votos. Y para ser un buen capuchino debemos ser menores y sencillos. ¿Podría de repente iluminarnos un poquito más?
Yo creo que tenemos los consejos evangélicos en común con todos los que están en la vida consagrada, ¿no? Pero el genio de San Francisco es de vivir la fraternidad y la tolerancia. Yo creo que es lo más característico de nuestra vida capuchina, y así debiéramos estar siempre cultivándolo. Pero como mencioné en la conferencia que preparé para los grupos que reunimos antes, nuestra vida, el primer paso tiene que ser la oración, un compromiso radical con oración. Luego, la fraternidad, que nace de una vida interior. Y una vez que tenemos esta fraternidad basada en nuestra vida de fe y oración, entonces podemos pensar en cómo vamos a vivir la pobreza de una forma con más entrega y más fidelidad al ideal de San Francisco. Muchas veces queremos empezar con la pobreza, pero yo creo que la oración tiene que ser el primer paso, luego la fraternidad y luego la pobreza. Pero obviamente para nosotros los consejos evangélicos son tan importantes, ¿no? En la primera expresión de la vida consagrada era las vírgenes en en los primeros siglos de la Iglesia. Y el celibato y la virginidad se vivía como un testimonio de la fe de la Iglesia en la resurrección de Jesucristo. Y sigue siendo eso hoy, y eso en el mundo de hoy es tan importante, ¿no? Y tenemos que vivir nuestro compromiso de castidad de tal forma que lo hacemos con alegría, con generosidad, y que sea un testimonio de la fe de la Iglesia en la resurrección de Cristo. No vamos a sobrevivir en nuestro prole, sino todos vamos a vivir eternamente en la vida del resucitado. Obediencia, lógicamente, también es tan importante en todas las expresiones de la vida consagrada. Y en algunas comunidades antiguas era el único voto, la única promesa era la obediencia. Pero yo creo que la aportación que hace Francisco de seguir al Cristo pobre y crucificado, y de encontrar en el leproso y el pobre un sacramento justo tan fuerte, es una aportación única y debiera ser una expresión muy especial de nuestra forma de vivir la vida religiosa de hoy.
A pergunta vem do Mato Grosso do Sul, do Frei Antônio. Como nós, capuchinhos, podemos viver uma igreja mais pan-americana, com rosto indígena, afrodescendente, latino, cigano e etc. E não um rosto eurocêntrico?
Eso sí es muy difícil y necesita mucho estudio, mucha conversación, pero también tenemos que estar dispuestos a correr riesgos, ¿no? Cuando yo estaba visitando los seminarios latinoamericanos, un seminario que visité estaba en Verapaz, cerca de Chiapas, y todos los seminaristas eran indígenas, eran como 60 seminaristas. Yo tenía que trabajar a través de un intérprete, ninguno hablaba castellano. Pero la biblioteca de ese seminario había como 20 libros. El presupuesto anual del seminario era $12,000 al año. Un poco después de la visita canónica, ese seminario desapareció. Si vamos a ser serios sobre las vocaciones, tenemos que dedicar recursos, personal, tiempo, planificación y también tener un poco de optimismo. Cuando yo llegué a Boston, el seminario estaba vacío. Estuvimos en plena crisis de la pedofilia. Yo acepté 3 de los mejores sacerdotes de la diócesis para promoción de vocaciones. Todos los sacerdotes estaban diciendo, ven del seminario, necesitamos de dinero, nunca se va a llenar. Yo dije, si vendemos el seminario, jamás tendremos otro. Y ahora, desde que llegué, he ordenado 150 sacerdotes. O sea, necesitamos un poco de optimismo, pero como le dije, dedicar recursos, personal, si vamos a fomentar vocaciones entre los indígenas, entre la población afroamericana también. Si no, no se va a cambiar. Es triste escuchar la situación en la zona la semana pasada, una monja que estuvo en Senegal, vino a hablar con nosotros, con Papa Francisco y los 8 cardenales sobre la experiencia desde el cielo. Y el número de indígenas que han pasado a otras iglesias es muy triste. Y es por descuido nuestro. Yo creo que tenemos que ser un poco tener optimismo, pero también generosidad, hacer sacrificios para que se hagan y dedicar tiempo, recursos, y mucha planificación para que se pueda realizar.
Sí, uno de los temas que nosotros estamos trabajando aquí es en las estructuras. Y dentro del tema de las estructuras hay una fuerte discusión sobre las parroquias. Capuchinhos fuimos fundadores de parroquias, de iglesias, y hoy tenemos un montón de parroquias. Y está la discusión parroquias sí, parroquias no. Como obispo, ¿qué necesita de los capuchinos? ¿Qué estructuras necesita un obispo hoy de los capuchinos?
Pues tantas parroquias capuchinas es un fenómeno americano por falta de clero en los Estados Unidos y en toda Latinoamérica. Nosotros teníamos que llenar el hueco, digamos. Incluso en los Estados Unidos hay muchos monasterios benedictinos que tienen docenas de parroquias alrededor de su monasterio, una cosa que es muy raro. Pero lo que hemos hecho con las parroquias ha sido muy importante. Lo importante es que nuestra vida parroquial sea una expresión de nuestro carisma, nuestra espiritualidad. Tiene que ser parte de la misión. No debería ser una parroquia como cualquier otra parroquia. Si va a ser una parroquia de capuchinos, pues entonces tiene que tener algo especial que aportar a esta comunidad, a nuestro ejemplo, de nuestra espiritualidad, compartir con ellos el franciscanismo. Pero yo creo que es un apostolado muy legítimo para nosotros, sobre todo en muchas partes son los movimientos apostólicos que han tomado el lugar de las parroquias. Lo ideal en la iglesia es que el lugar pastoral debería ser la parroquia. Y nosotros tenemos una misión de tratar de fortalecer este ministerio que es tan importante.
A proposta do Papa Francisco de uma igreja pobre para os pobres deve certamente tocar de modo muito especial a nós, capuchinhos. Como que o senhor vê esse nosso compromisso com os pobres hoje no nosso mundo? E que desafio temos pela frente quanto a esse compromisso com os pobres?
Pues como yo mencioné antes, hay tantas alusiones en las constituciones sobre la conveniencia de que los frailes vivan y compartan la pobreza y el sufrimiento de los pobres. pero yo veo que son pocos los experimentos que se hacen. Yo estoy convencido de que si tuviéramos más experiencias de esas, ayudaría a la comunidad entera de estar más consciente de nuestra vocación, de ser pobres y acompañar a los pobres. Pero no puede ser simplemente una cosa social, por eso insisto que este íter tiene que empezar con la contemplación, la fraternidad y luego una pobreza radical. Pero muchas veces estamos tan ligados a hacer cosas de una forma muy clase media, desde como los pobres. Necesitamos ser un poco más arriesgados.
¿Alguien más quiere?
Gracias por compartir, sobre todo sus sentimientos. Me llamó la atención cuando habló acerca de los temores. Usted experimentó personalmente al momento de tomar algunas opciones. Y nosotros ahora hablamos de cambio de estructuras, de colaboración. Seguramente alguna de las cosas que podemos sentir a nivel personal es el temor. Como sabemos, el temor nos puede paralizar. Nos sentimos seguros en las estructuras. Podemos sentirnos seguros en una provincia, en un convento. Sin embargo, el dar el paso requiere valentía. Y usted mencionó algunos momentos en que tuvo que salir de esas zonas de seguridad para hacer aquello que sentía que Dios lo llamaba. Quizá nosotros podemos en algunos momentos sentir el temor de una colaboración. ¿Qué va a pasar? ¿Saldrá bien? ¿No saldrá bien? El cambiar una estructura y abandonar algunas por tener algunas opciones más evangélicas. ¿Qué nos recomendaría? ¿Qué nos aconsejaría desde esa vivencia personal para que nosotros también podamos superar esos temores?
Pues como traté de comunicar en la conferencia que acabo de dar, es que es la conversión personal y comunitaria que es necesaria para que el carisma esté presente en el mundo. Y mientras más convertidos estamos como individuos y comunidades, más fuerte va a ser el carisma. Estamos aquí por la conversión de San Francisco y la conversión de los primeros franciscanos capuchinos, porque ellos estaban convertidos no solo como individuos, sino también como comunidades. Y así la fraternidad es tan importante, no simplemente para divertirnos y gozar de la compañía y evitar la soledad, no, es una vocación que compartimos y una conversión que tenemos que hacer juntos. Y esa conversión nos dará el valor de correr los riesgos necesarios para que podamos responder a estas grandes necesidades pastorales de la iglesia de hoy.
Quizás tendríamos que ir caso
Sim. A pergunta chega de Frei Daniel Soares, da província do Brasil Central. Ele traz alguns dados e no fim faz a pergunta. Ele pergunta ao senhor, então, que é um frade que chega ao 3º grau da ordem ao episcopado, mas é um frade. Ele diz que, ao mesmo tempo, se percebe, nesse nosso momento, um grande número de saídas de frades presbíteros para os cleros diocesanos. E ele percebe também, tanto na ordem quanto fora dela, um acento, às vezes demasiado, no uso das vestes, na observância das rubricas rituais, na maneira como se exerce esse papel ministerial nas redes sociais, um domínio que, segundo o parecer dele, se afasta bastante da vida fraterna e minorítica. Como superar as tendências clericalistas desses nossos tempos entre nós, frades?
Pues, una vez más, se trata de conversión. El clericalismo es una doença que faz o Papa Francisco sempre está a falar disso. Para nós, a fraternidade, o ideal de São Francisco não permite o clericalismo. Ontem, quando tivemos a cerimônia sobre os novos beatos e os venerados, pensei, acho que não é nenhum cardeal capuchinho que chegou a ser sábio. Estou rezando por cardeal Massaia, talvez tenha, mas mais alto, menos possibilidades de santidade. Assim, graças a Deus que os meus irmãos me mantêm humilde, lembrando-me de todos os meus defeitos.
Muito bem. Yo quería hacer una pregunta, tal vez será la última, y después ya vamos a terminar lo que viene a seguir. Estamos con 9 años de pontificado del Papa Francisco, el Papa que está franciscanizando la Iglesia, por así decir, en tantos sentidos. En estos 9 años, en una Iglesia en salida, en una Iglesia pobre con los pobres, usted, la lectura que hace desde fuera, pero que tiene una visión de la orden en las Américas, tal vez en Europa, siente que nosotros estamos aprovechando la oportunidad que está dando el Papa Francisco. La orden ha cambiado en algo su vuelto en estos 9 años.
Es una buena pregunta, pero no sé, yo creo que la situación del orden en algunos países es alarmante, pero al mismo tiempo yo estoy convencido de que el ideal de San Francisco es tan bello y tan atractivo. Si nosotros lo estamos viviendo intensamente, si nuestra conversión es intensa, entonces eso va a ser un imán para atraer a otros. Cuando el Papa declaró un año de misericordia, la respuesta fue una cosa maravillosa. Yo he vivido muchos años santos en mi larga vida, pero ninguno tuvo el impacto que ese año. Y yo quedé muy conmovido cuando él trajo, Pío y Leopoldo, a San Pedro en Roma, y los millares de personas que desfilaron frente a las urnas de los dos santos capuchinos que encarnaban ese ministerio de misericordia y de bondad. Yo creo que tenemos una oportunidad muy grande, no debiéramos despreciarlo, ¿no? Y el Papa Francisco, como le dije, ha rescatado del franciscanismo, del romanticismo, para subrayar la radicalidad de nuestra vocación. Nosotros tenemos que abrazar eso.
Pues una vez más, gracias, Cardenal Omale, por su presencia, por su palabra, por su testimonio de vida en medio de nosotros. Les saludamos aún con un aplauso. Ahora quisiéramos invitar a los 3 conferencistas del día de hoy que vengan aquí delante. Cardenal, el hermano Seán, el hermano Bernardo, por favor. Esto a los 3. Y queremos pedir a los 3 consejeros de las Américas que se acerquen. A los 3 consejeros. Hemos tratado de verificar de los mejores ejemplares que teníamos en las lenguas diferentes, ¿no? Para poder también vivir este momento. No tenemos mucho con qué agradecer o con qué pagar, pero quisiéramos en la dinámica del regalo hacer un gesto de profunda gratitud a ustedes por lo que nos dieran en este día. Sabemos que el Encuentro Panamericano será marcado por las iluminaciones que ustedes nos dieran. Así que con nuestros consejeros queremos hacer la entrega de un recuerdo de este Panamericano. Gracias. Muy bien, gracias. Sí, ya. Se me queda. Muy bien, hermanos. En nuestro programa tenemos una iluminación del ministro general. Al final de este día, de las 3 grandes iluminaciones, queremos decantar un poco de las tantas informaciones, escuchando al sucesor de San Francisco, que lo tenemos aquí con nosotros y que es todo un privilegio. Así que atentamente, aunque estemos cansados, queremos escucharlo. ¿Usted hablará en italiano? Bueno, entonces los traductores especiales
Non preoccupatevi, non ci metterò tanto tempo. Ci sono pronto?
Sì.
Prima di tutto vorrei leggervi questa mail. Pace il Signore Gesù è risorto. È una mail inviata a Piotr. Caro fratello Piotr, desidero informarti sulla nostra situazione questa volta in Russia. Ti chiedo anche di informare Padre Roberto, Ministro Generale. Invierò una copia di questa lettera anche al mio provinciale Marek Listrisky e al custode della Bielorussia, da Andrzej. Come sai, l'occupazione russa dell'Ucraina ha un'influenza molto forte sulla nostra vita in Ucraina e in Russia. Dai media, dalle mie letture quotidiane e dalle nostre frequenti conversazioni telefoniche, sai cosa ci sta succedendo in Ucraina. Con l'aiuto di Dio, con l'aiuto di tutto il nostro ordine, ce la facciamo in qualche modo. Tutti i frati sono nelle nostre fraternità. Abbiamo sempre più difficoltà a mantenere una presenza stabile in Russia. Qualche tempo fa abbiamo avuto una conversazione comune online con i frati che si erano riuniti in un convento per celebrare la Pasqua. Significativamente nella nostra conversazione siamo stati raggiunti da Fra Marek, il nostro ministro provinciale. L'argomento principale della nostra conversazione era la nostra continua presenza cappuccina in Russia. Una settimana fa
i servizi responsabili degli stranieri in Russia, le strutture dell'ex KGB, sono venuti dai fratelli a Voronezh e hanno preso il fratello Jacek per un controllo di routine. Si è scoperto che 3 agenti hanno interrogato Jacek. L'interrogatorio è durato fino a 6 ore. Non c'è stato alcun impatto fisico, ma l'impatto psicologico è stato molto alto. Il risultato dell'interrogatorio: Jacek deve lasciare la Russia entro 3 mesi, cioè entro il 15 giugno. Jacek sarà lì per la fine di questo periodo e purtroppo deve partire. Vale la pena ricordare che Jacek aveva documenti validi fino a giugno. Un giorno dopo altri 2 fratelli hanno ricevuto il permesso per altri 3 mesi. Dato il caso di Jacek, non sono sicuro che questi fratelli potranno rimanere fino a quella data, cioè fino al 7 luglio. Per riassumere, ci sono attualmente 2 fratelli in Russia e Voronezh fino al 15 giugno. Dal 15 ce ne sarà solo uno. A Belgorod ci sono attualmente 3 fratelli, 2 dei quali sono registrati temporaneamente fino a luglio. Attualmente di questi 5 fratelli solo 2 hanno una registrazione permanente in Russia. È molto probabile che solo 2 fratelli possano rimanere in Russia. Aggiungo solo che ieri un parroco messicano è stato espulso dalla Russia, da Mosca, con l'obbligo di partire entro 24 ore. Si scopre che la registrazione permanente che 2 fratelli hanno non è una garanzia del loro soggiorno prolungato in Russia. Ci sono 5 fratelli, un ucraino e 4 polacchi. Tutti loro esprimono il desiderio di rimanere in Russia. Uno di loro, Fra Marek, che è stato con noi fin dall'inizio, sta chiedendo ufficiosamente ai suoi superiori il permesso di diventare cittadino russo. Nel prossimo futuro, dunque, potremmo non riuscire a mantenere formalmente la nostra presenza in Russia. Ti chiedo di riflettere come ministro provinciale nel nostro tempo libero sulla nostra presenza qui. Noi, come custode dell'Ucraina e della provincia polacche, non siamo, per ragioni formali della situazione di guerra, non riusciamo a mantenere la nostra presenza in Russia. Secondo me occorrerà qualche aiuto, eccetera, eccetera. Ancora una volta ti chiedo di presentare per Roberto la mia richiesta. Sono in comunicazione con i fratelli di Russia e con il ministro provinciale Marek. Venite a trovarci, vi invito. E vi riferite in biblioteca fra Blasei, custode di Kiev. Direi che cosa c'entra questa comunicazione in questo contesto dell'incontro panamericano? Beh, a me sembrava bello vedendo anche l'entusiasmo con cui state lavorando e vivendo in questi giorni, che certamente è un entusiasmo che non esclude la situazione di altri nostri fratelli in giro per il mondo. E allora mi piaceva farvi parte di queste situazioni, perché proprio nel nostro lavoro di incontro, di confronto, di verifica, di progetto per il futuro, credo che sia tanto importante camminare anche con ali più ampie ancora di quelle che sono le regioni delle Americhe. In questo momento io volevo solo aggiungere questo: l'intuizione originaria che abbiamo avuto col Consiglio, abbiamo, come dire, un po' di soddisfazione personale nel vedere il lavoro che è stato realizzato in questi 3 anni e nel vedere questo incontro. Siamo qua abbastanza del Consiglio, è proprio una cosa bella quella che sta accadendo. Né il ministro generale né nessun altro di noi forse pensava di riuscire così a vedere che l'ordine nelle Americhe si è messo in cammino in maniera molto, molto significativa, molto forte, molto partecipata. nessuno di noi poteva pensare, forse potevamo sognarlo nell'animo perché l'ordine nostro. A proposito, chi ha detto, a proposito di razze, vedete, io ho la faccia nera, sono africano, ho anche la faccia bianca, sono anche europeo, ho anche la faccia, dicono così, gialla, sono anche asiatico. Io mi sento un cittadino del mondo. Anche Ilian è così, è una faccia un po' diversa dalla mia, ma siamo così. E noi siamo Capuchinhos, siamo così. No, voglio approfittare in particolare per ringraziare i 3 consiglieri dell'area, mettendo dentro anche Carlos evidentemente, e anche per ringraziare gli ufficiali della Curia che molto hanno seguito la lavoro. Ma poi anche per esprimervi l'ammirazione. Qualcuno ha già detto questi giorni, forse il cammino che stiamo facendo noi può essere utile per l'ordine. Certamente sarà utile per l'ordine, quantomeno l'ordine ne prenderà in considerazione per vedere cosa succede, riceverà uno spunto per fare anche da altre parti lo stesso cammino che fate anche voi. Questo mi piace molto. Se ben capisco quello che Papa Francesco, una cosa sulla quale insiste Papa Francesco è che l'importante per noi non è arrivare a ottenere chissà che risultati, ma ad aprire percorsi. Se questo è un percorso di fraternità che si è aperto con così grande forza nelle Americhe, beh, questo percorso valido porterà dei frutti, certamente alcuni arrivano già in questi giorni, altri arriveranno in futuro. Dobbiamo ringraziare il Signore di tutto questo, dobbiamo ringraziare veramente di cuore il Signore. Come dicevo la prima lettera, ero certissimo che l'America aveva troppe forze ancora che devono essere rimesse in moto, perché mi sembra che sono ripartiti. Merito sorprendente dell'adesione di tutti voi, merito forse che avete trovato le persone giuste che hanno animato, ma non c'è dubbio che c'è stata il coinvolgimento di tutti. Ecco. Io dico grazie Signore intanto per tutto questo. Dopo altre cose più puntuali ce le diremo nei prossimi giorni, non vanno avanti i lavori, perché prima di tutto mi piace sentire a che conclusioni voi arrivate col vostro cammino. Dopo chiaro, ciascuno per il proprio ruolo metterà il proprio contributo, ma questo esercizio di ascoltarci vicendevolmente, in questo ascoltarci vicendevolmente opera molto di più nostro Signore e non impartire da progetti già precostituiti e più o meno imporli. Grazie fratelli, basta, abbiamo un po' di tempo per riposarci prima della preghiera, non aggiungo altro per adesso perché mi hanno imposto di dire queste cose, non questa mi fa piacere comunicarla, ma dopo sono sempre i segretari che comandano, quindi anche il ministro generale deve obbedire, perché io sono timido, di solito non intervengo, ma quando intervengo troppo.
Grazie Ministro delle sue parole, saremo attenti ad ascoltarle tutte le altre volte perché l'esito del nostro